Thank you. If those of you who want to continue a conversation could take it to the atrium, we appreciate it. Session 4, restoration. John, it's yours.
Good afternoon. I'm back. But I brought some friends, and some very, very learned friends as well. In fact, this fellow immediately to my left, Jim Tripp, has been a friend of mine since the 70s, and it's really a delight to have him here with us. He's the General Counsel of the Environmental Defense Fund. Steve Murawski is one of the newest members of the academic community, as I understand it. Some of you may not even have known that, but Steve is now at the University of South Florida. Excuse me. But obviously known to many of you as an advisor for National Marine Fisheries at NOAA for a number of years, and have been involved in those issues for many years, and someone I know people look to on these issues, was active in the NOAA's oil spill activities. Jim Ayers is one of my new friends. Hope Jim and I get to know each other better, as he's had what probably feels to him like a lifetime of experience dealing with another well-known oil spill in the Prince William Sound in Alaska, known as the Exxon Valdez. He was very involved with that. He's now with Alaska Strategy as a conservation consulting firm, but he was also in many roles, including, as I recall, Chief of Staff to the Alaska Governor during the spill years, and worked on the Oil Spill Trustee Council, where they pretty much put together their program from scratch. And he's here to help us think through some of what we might want to think about as we put together this new venture that Lisa Jackson is chairing, that I've been asked to serve as staff director for, the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force. Jim's already said, well, you want to look at this, you don't want to think about that, so we're really, I'm going to drag him into my office and pick his brain clean before the day's over, so I hope you all will start that process for me. And another very good friend, Cindy Donor with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's the regional director in Atlanta. Some of you may know that I did a stint in Atlanta as the regional administrator of EPA there, and we had a very good working relationship with Fish and Wildlife Service, with Cindy and Sam Hamilton, who was there when I was there, and she's really she's in so many roles involved with the natural resources damages assessment, the task force, federal administrator, and all this, that she tells me that it's easy for her to have a meeting on these issues, so all she has to do is talk to herself. So I always try to limit that a little bit, but I don't want to get too carried away. So we have a very good group. I may not be able to resist chiming in a little bit on some of this as well, but I don't think this is a shy group, so I don't think we're going to have any trouble eliciting responses from these folks. Chip gave an excellent, where did Chip go? Chip gave an excellent presentation on restoration and the challenges that we face. I heard some of the impacts panel, and we're going to talk about restoration more than just the restoration of the components of the oil spill, but we're going to talk about sort of the larger picture, as Chip did, about restoration in the Gulf. With that, I guess they ran out of budget to hire another journalist, so I'm going to be Geraldo Rivera today and get to ask questions. Cindy Donor already struck one of my questions that I had, but anyway, if she doesn't behave, I'll go back to it, Cindy. So I'm just telling you right now, those things in Las Vegas, and they don't stay there. So let me just tell you that we can always bring that up. The first I'd like to do is kind of set the table to let our panelists talk about what is the most significant issue in the Gulf, and not so much as an issue. First of all, start as a resource. I like to start with the positive. why should we care about the Gulf of Mexico? I mean, why is it such an important and wonderful place? And then what is your concern about that in terms of a threat that requires restoration? Then we'll talk more specifically about restoration and what we might do in trying to address some of those concerns. Jim, you want to start us off? You should have had one. I'm in a little rock band. I never give up my microphone, so I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, the first part of that question is, why should we be concerned about the Gulf from a national point of view? It's a beautiful area. Culturally, it's distinctive. The Gulf is a very productive fishery. A large part of, although I knew John from Florida work that I did quite a while ago, early in my EDF career, a large part of my work has been in Louisiana, concerned with what's happening to the Mississippi Delta ecosystem. But there are very important national assets located in the Gulf, and particularly in the coastal Louisiana area. Something like 1/3 of the oil and gas infrastructure in the United States. Tremendously important navigation, shipping lanes, not only the Mississippi River, but the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, important for tourism. So one can make the case, both from an economic and environmental point of view, that the Gulf is very important. And I would focus it very particularly on the Delta. Now, what should we be concerned about? A couple of the earlier speakers sort of suggested the oil spill was sort of a burp or something like that. The oil spill I see more of as being sort of a classical point source of pollution, just a real punch. But the basso continuo of Gulf degradation is the ongoing decline and collapse of the delta of the Mississippi River, coastal Louisiana, and of course the tremendous pouring of nutrients into the Gulf. And both of those issues, if we're really seriously going to talk about restoration, yes, we have to talk about the other 4 states, obviously the Everglades, but the central focus has to be on the restoration of the delta.
Steve, you want to, I think I know what you might talk about, but I'm going to give you some latitude.
Well, good. So I certainly want to amplify on the ecosystem services that we just talked about. That apparently it's the 29th largest economy in the world, and that's important in its own right. But it really
9th largest water body in the world.
Okay. I do think that we need to focus on the fact that the Gulf is the gateway to the Midwest, and when we talk about the Gulf, we talk about the 5 Gulf states, but really it's the entire watershed that we're talking about. And so when we do that, we see that it opens up the economies for all the communities along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and others. And so what happens there, and then what in terms of their impact on the Gulf, and what the impacts on the Gulf are to the rest of that Midwest economy is important. The other point I'd like to make is that it's not like Las Vegas. What happens in the Gulf doesn't necessarily stay in the Gulf. For example, a bluefin tuna will spawn there, and it will go all the way to Cape Breton and sometimes cross back and forth to the Atlantic. And so in a very real sense, it's an export conveyor for the rest of the globe.
I think that the previous panel, as well as Jim and Steve, have covered that pretty well. I think Steve's point about how what happens in the Gulf affects the rest of not only probably the United States, but in many ways, like the bluefin tuna, sea turtles, as well as the fact that you're talking about a $600 to $800 million a year fishery that feeds a great part of America, provides seafood, and second only to Alaska, of course. But perhaps more importantly, what the Gulf is telling us today is that these large marine ecosystems of our country make us who we are economically and culturally. And I suspect that the Gulf is telling us that, and that's probably one of the most important features of what's happening. And it isn't just the Deepwater Horizon. It's just the blow, as Jim Tripp said, on top of 70 years of degradation. But all of those things that we're talking about, from bluefin tuna to the shrimp, the migratory marine mammals, all are a part of who we are. And yet, we're now being asked, do we care enough, or is oil more important?
So I'm just going to add on a little bit to what everybody else said. I think Steve said it was a gateway to the Midwest, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, the Mississippi River drains 41% of the continent. That's a lot that comes down. There's several flyways that go through the Gulf. There's over 400 species of bird that spend some time in the Gulf, and tens of millions that migrate through. If we're talking about fish and wildlife resources, there's hundreds of species of fish, 40 endangered species, and I could go on and about the importance of the fish and wildlife and the habitat that's down there. Not only that, like Jim said, the communities and the economy that's down there, and the life that we have in the Gulf, and the people that live there.
Steve, could you talk a little bit more about the sort of the deep water part of the Gulf? This is a part that, when you're looking across the Gulf, it doesn't look any different than the rest of it, but there is a real miraculous world down there. Are there concerns that you have in terms of restoration that we need to look at for the deep water part of the Gulf?
Well, absolutely. I think, we have focused a lot on what's happening in the marshes and what's happening in the relatively shallow areas. But remember, the well itself was a mile deep, and that certainly wasn't even among the deepest of the wells. Many wells over 10,000 feet of water, and certainly deeper than that. If you look at the geography of the Gulf of Mexico, the average depth is over a mile. It's a very deep system that comes very close to land. There's a lot of concern these days about what might be longer-term impacts at the bottom, seafloor bottom. There's a substantial deep coral and biogenic community in that region. More and more evidence that there's residual oil on the bottom, as well as drilling mud and other things. And so one thing we know, and I think Chip alluded to this, that our ability to actually do restoration activities as opposed to monitor and protect is a lot different in those kinds of habitats. And so one would expect that the recovery rates of long-lived and slow-growing animals are going to be much different than what's at the surface and what's at the salt marsh.
There was a question earlier about protected areas. Would protected areas be part of the restoration toolbox in terms of fisheries? Do you think there's issues there that need to be looked at in our larger look at the Gulf?
Well, there's an interesting view in natural resource management in the oceans, and that is, what is the totality of all the protection measures that you've got going. The fishery management councils in the region have recently enacted measures to end overfishing. That doesn't necessarily mean resources are on a close path to rebuilding, but nevertheless, those are in play and they have to be accounted for. There are a number of protected areas already in the region that are either seasonal or long-term closures. From the point of view of restoration, how would marine protected areas actually work? And in this case, they might be viewed as compensatory restoration as opposed to direct restoration. And that is there a certain threat out there that if you abated it, that it would actually provide some other service or a compensatory service to what was destroyed? And so one would have to look very closely at what the nature of the current threats are to actually design an MPA that would be effective in this compensation.
Cindy?
So land protection, either restoration, protection through easements or acquisition, when you're talking about the habitat, you're talking about the marsh and you're talking about the beaches. If you think about long-term restoration, and when you factor in all the other things, not only about the natural resource damage assessment, but the long-term restoration process that you have to go through with the task force and the developing the plan with the state and the other partners, you have to think about things like sea level rise and taking the lands that we have and making sure that